My name is Marjorie Ellison. I am 67 years old. The air inside Charleston County Courthouse was heavy with the scent of varnish and old paper, like every judgment ever passed in that room still lingered in the wood. My shoes made a steady click on the marble floor, the sound too loud in the hush. Faces turned as I entered a small ripple that moved from bench to bench until it reached the defense table. That was where my son sat. Daniel didn't look up. His shoulders, once straight and strong, were slightly hunched, as if he could hide from what was coming. Beside him, my daughter-in-law Claire turned her head and met my gaze with a small, polished smile. It wasn't the smile of politeness. It was a private smirk, the kind that says I've already won. I had seen that smile before at family dinners, when she corrected me in front of guests, when she'd placed her hand on Daniel's arm, as if steadying him against his own mother. But never had it cut as deep as it did in that room. The judge lifted his gavel to call the session to order, then froze. His hand hung in the air, trembling slightly. For a heartbeat, his face changed recognition, disbelief. He leaned toward the clerk, and though he meant to whisper the words, carried through the silence. Dear God, is that really her? I stood a few feet from the table, every eye fixed on me, and for the first time in months, I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes after you've been emptied of everything else. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The high windows let in stripes of pale morning light falling across the polished benches and the state seal behind the judge's chair. I could smell rain on the air. Charleston rain, damp and salt-tinged from the harbor. Somewhere down the hallway, a typewriter clacked in another office, a faint rhythm beneath the tension. Claire adjusted her silk blouse and whispered something to Daniel. He didn't answer. His wedding ring caught the light when he finally lifted his hand to rub his temple. My son had his father's hands broad square made for building, though he'd never built anything real in his life. The bailiff cleared his throat. Case number 2135, Ellison versus Ellison. Hearing my name paired with theirs sent a pulse of heat through my chest. I kept my eyes on the table where the folders were stacked neat and new, as if the lies they contained had never seen dust. I took my seat at the plaintiff's side. My attorney, Edward Hale, gave me a small nod, more of a reassurance than a greeting. The man had aged since I last saw him. His hair was thinner, his glasses heavier. Yet his presence was steady, like a wall between me and the chaos across the aisle. Across from us, Claire leaned close to Daniel again. She looks tired, I heard her murmur. Let her have her performance. I almost smiled. They thought I came here to beg. The clerk handed documents to the judge. The rustle of paper filled the room. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor long and low. I felt it in my chest before I heard it. Mrs. Ellison, the judge, said, his voice returning to its official tone, though his eyes were still unsettled. You may proceed. I rose slowly. My knees ached, but my back stayed straight. When I looked at Daniel, my only son, the boy who once clung to my hand during thunderstorms, I saw not hatred, but distance. A stranger's kind of distance. He couldn't hold my gaze for more than a second. I placed the folder on the table before me. The edges were worn from the months I had carried it, the papers inside smoothed and refolded until they no longer made noise when I opened them. This I said quietly, is the truth of my home and of the hands that took it. The first page slid free under the judge's gaze. I saw his brow crease, his mouth tighten. Claire shifted again, her confidence flickering. Daniel's foot tapped once beneath the table, a sound barely audible yet frantic. I thought of the oak trees outside the courthouse, the same ones that had shaded our family home on Meeting Street. Their roots ran deep, older than any of us. My husband used to say a house was only as honest as the people who kept it. Somewhere along the years that honesty had been traded for signatures and smiles. The judge cleared his throat and looked between us. "We'll hear the opening statements," he said. As I sat down, the room's stillness pressed in again. I could feel the rain begin to fall against the tall windows, a soft percussion, like breath against glass. For a brief moment, I imagined I was back in that house, standing by the kitchen window, watching the storm roll in over Charleston Harbor. Only this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. I was already where I needed to be. And as the first drops darkened the courthouse steps outside, I knew the story that began with a signature was about to be rewritten. 1 year earlier, the sun over Charleston had the soft warmth of late spring, the kind that made the magnolias open like small promises. My husband Henry had just come home from the hospital after his stroke. He moved slower now, but his voice still carried that quiet authority I'd loved since the day I met him. We spent mornings on the porch, the two of us wrapped in the hum of cicadas and the smell of honeysuckle. Daniel came by every afternoon, papers in hand, his tie loosened like he'd just come from saving the world. "Mom," he said, "you shouldn't have to worry about any of this. Let me handle the finances. It's time we simplify things." I wanted to believe him. He was my only child, and I'd raised him to be careful, honest, deliberate. His father had trusted him with the family accounts, and I saw no reason to doubt him. Claire, his wife, sat beside him at the dining table, her pen already poised. "It's just to make things smoother," she said, flashing that easy smile of hers. "We'll consolidate the properties, move everything under one management file. Less paperwork for you, less stress for Henry." I remember the way Henry looked at me, then his right hand trembling slightly on the tablecloth. "If it makes things easier for you, Marjorie," he murmured. "Go ahead." I signed where Daniel pointed, page after page, initials here, full name there. The notary they'd brought with them barely looked up. When it was done, Daniel kissed my cheek and promised to take care of everything. The next morning, Claire sent flowers, white lilies, with a note that read, "A fresh start." 3 months later, Henry was gone. The house felt different without him, larger, emptier, like it belonged to someone else. I filled my days with small routines, watering the camellias, polishing the banister, ironing Daniel's father's old shirts that still smelled faintly of cedar. Then one Thursday afternoon, the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and charity envelopes was a thick white packet stamped "Notice of Eviction." I thought there must be a mistake. My name was on it. Marjorie L. Ellison, occupant, but the property owner listed was Daniel Ellison. My chest tightened. I read it again, slower this time, tracing each word as if they could rearrange themselves into something sensible. The document referenced a deed transfer filed with the county clerk 3 months earlier, the same week I'd signed those papers. The phone slipped from my hand before I realized I'd dropped it. I drove to Daniel's office on East Bay Street the next morning, the letter trembling in my purse. His receptionist smiled politely, told me he was in a meeting. When he finally appeared, his face was calm, professional, almost detached. "Mom," he said, "I was going to explain everything. The new title was just a temporary transfer for tax purposes. It's still your house on paper, on paper." My voice sounded strange in that room, thinner than I meant it to. "You signed my home away and didn't think to tell me," he sighed, glancing toward the glass wall where Claire's reflection hovered. "You're overreacting. It's just business. Everything's safe. You'll always have a place there. Always." The word hit like a splinter. That evening, I returned to Meeting Street, walked through each room in silence. The chandeliers caught the dimming light, scattering it across the polished floors. Every corner held the story of a life I'd thought was secure, the wall of family photographs, the scuffed step Henry had promised to repair the garden we planted after Daniel was born. When the movers came a week later, I didn't argue. I let them take the furniture, the china, even the grandfather clock that had chimed at our wedding anniversary. I carried only a small box. Henry's watch, a few books, and one photograph of Daniel at 10 years old, missing a front tooth and holding his first fishing pole. The house on Meeting Street stood behind me like a stranger watching from a window. When the car pulled away, I didn't look back. I told myself I was leaving only a building, not a home. But as the oak-lined streets disappeared in the rearview mirror, I knew that wasn't true. The home I'd built had been signed away with my own hand. The apartment I found was small and square, tucked behind a row of weather-beaten cottages near the marshlands east of Charleston. The walls were the color of unpolished bone, and the single window faced a stretch of reeds that swayed whenever the tide shifted. It wasn't what I'd imagined for this stage of life, but it was all I could afford after the move. The first nights were too quiet. I'd been used to the sound of the harbor, the creak of old wood, and the soft rhythm of Henry's breathing beside me. Here, silence pressed against me like a weight. I kept the radio on, sometimes not for music, but for voices, so the place would feel less like exile. Each morning, I walked to the bus stop by the highway, bought groceries, and returned before noon. I told myself, routine would keep me sane. I washed the same few dishes, folded laundry that barely filled a basket, and stared at the window when the marsh flooded with late afternoon light. Then one morning, a letter arrived, an envelope marked Confidential Property and Mortgage Division. I set it on the counter and stared at it through half a cup of cold tea. When I finally opened it, my hands trembled, not from fear, but something quieter, like recognition. The letter thanked me for my consent to finalize the property transfer and enclosed a summary of the transaction. My name was typed neatly at the top, followed by a signature so perfect it could have been traced from my own hand. I read the page 3 times. The pen strokes had the same loop on the M, the same slight hesitation before the E. I'd seen that hesitation every time I signed school permission slips for Daniel when he was a boy. The realization didn't come all at once, it crept in slow and cold. Someone had studied me long enough to imitate my name. Someone I'd trusted. I called the number listed at the bottom of the letter, waded through the recordings, and finally spoke to a clerk. Her voice was polite, detached. "Yes, Mrs. Ellison," she said. "The documents were signed under your authority. Everything appears valid." "I didn't sign anything," I whispered. A pause. Then the same tone, practiced and empty. "You'll need to take it up with your family's representative. The transfer's already recorded." When the call ended, the silence returned thicker now. Outside, a heron glided across the marsh wings, catching the sun. The beauty of it felt cruel, how the world could stay so still while everything inside me unraveled. I laid the letter flat on the kitchen table and studied the ink again. I'd always thought handwriting carried something of the soul, a trace no one could duplicate. Seeing mine stolen so cleanly, so clinically, felt like watching my reflection blink when I hadn't. By evening, the tide had risen high enough to cover the path outside. The reeds swayed under the water shadows, moving like ghosts beneath the surface. I closed the curtains, locking the room into dimness. That night, I dreamed of the old house on Meeting Street, the chandelier flickering the echo of Daniel's laughter in the hall. But in the dream, the front door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pushed, the lock turned against me, my own signature carved into the brass keyhole. When I woke, the room was still and airless, the light pale and sharp through the blinds. I sat at the table again, the forged letter before me, and felt something inside me shift. Not rage yet, not even sorrow, just the faint, undeniable start of knowing that what had happened wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Someone had decided I didn't deserve my own name. Sunday mornings in Charleston still carried a kind of civility, even for those of us who had fallen from the better side of town. I hadn't attended service since Henry's funeral, but that week I woke before dawn, dressed in my navy skirt and pearl earrings, and walked to St. Augustine's. The church bell rang through the cool air, a sound that used to feel like comfort. The pews were crowded, filled with faces I'd known for decades, neighbors, old colleagues, people who had once called me Mrs. Ellison with respect that now lingered on the edge of pity. I sat near the back, keeping my eyes on the hymnal. After the service, the congregation spilled into the churchyard cafe, where silver urns of coffee steamed beside plates of lemon squares. The chatter was light donations, children's recitals, upcoming weddings. I thought I might slip away unnoticed until I heard her voice. Claire. She stood near the pastry table, the same composed elegance she'd worn at my dining room years earlier when she convinced me to sign those papers. A small circle of women gathered around her, their laughter low but unmistakably admiring. "Meeting Street finally feels like home," Claire said, her tone smooth as satin. "Daniel's been so busy with the renovations, he's making it our own." My hand tightened around my paper cup. She spoke the words "our own" like an accomplishment, not theft. One of the women asked something I couldn't catch, and Claire laughed lightly. "Oh, Marjorie's fine. She needed a simpler place. It was all for the best." I turned before anyone noticed me. The coffee tasted metallic in my mouth. Inside the small church library, I stood alone between the shelves of hymnals, breathing slowly. Through the window, I could see Claire's reflection in the glass, her white dress, her confident gestures. To everyone else, she was still the model daughter-in-law, devoted wife, quiet benefactor. To me, she was the reason my home had a new owner's name etched into its title. Marjorie. I turned to see a tall man leaning on a cane near the door. It took me a moment to recognize him. William Harmon, once a circuit judge, now retired, but still carrying that quiet authority that made people lower their voices in his presence. He'd known Henry for years. "I almost didn't recognize you," he said softly. His eyes flicked toward the courtyard. I heard the talk. I forced a thin smile. "People always talk." "Yes," he said, "but this kind has claws." He walked closer, his cane tapping against the floor. "Forgive me if I speak plainly. I've seen that kind of story before. A signature here, a missing page there. It starts polite and ends poisonous." I looked down at the open hymnal between us, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. "What would you do?" I asked. "Never confront," he said, voice steady. "Document. Rage makes noise, but proof makes law." He slipped a folded business card into my palm. Edward Hale, attorney at law. I remembered the name vaguely from Henry's papers, an associate who'd handled estate matters years ago. "He's decent," Harmon said. "Quiet. Knows how to read between ink lines. If something's been changed, he'll find it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, Claire's laughter carried faintly through the open window. "Thank you," I said. Harmon nodded once and turned to leave. "You still have time," he said over his shoulder, "but don't wait too long." Memories fade faster than evidence. When I stepped back into the courtyard, the crowd was thinning. Claire was gone. Only her perfume lingered, a trace of jasmine and confidence. I walked home through streets lined with blooming azaleas, their petals scattering across the sidewalk like fragments of the past. In my apartment, I placed the card on the table beside the forged letter. The two pieces of paper lay side by side, one born of deceit, the other of possibility. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and for the first time since losing my home, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something waiting to move. 3 days after my conversation with Judge Harmon, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. It bore no return address, only my name written in deliberate cursive across the front, Mrs. Marjorie Ellison. The handwriting was careful but slightly shaky, the kind that belonged to a man who'd once written with confidence but now fought age and tremor. I carried it inside as if it were fragile glass. The late afternoon sun cut through the blinds, laying thin stripes of light across my kitchen table. I traced the ink of my name with my finger before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of stationery embossed with faint gold lettering. Hale and Wexler, attorneys at law. Below it, written in a hand I remembered from Henry's old documents, were 9 words that made my throat tighten. Meet me before they erase everything that's left. No signature, only a date and time. Tuesday, 10 a.m. I read it twice, then a third time. The simplicity of the message frightened me more than any threat could have. There was no explanation, no details, just a sense of urgency that reached out from the page. I set the letter beside the forged bank notice and sat for a long while, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The marsh outside was quiet, except for the occasional bird cry. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. Henry had trusted Edward Hale with our estate plans years ago. I hadn't seen him since the funeral. Daniel had handled all the follow-up meetings. It struck me now that I'd simply let that happen, trusted that the man I once called my son would protect what his father left behind. I made tea and watched the steam curl upward. The letter sat where I'd left it, its presence growing heavier with every minute. I didn't know what erase meant. Documents, money, my name, whatever it was, it implied movement. Someone somewhere still working to cover their tracks. When night fell, I pulled out the old photo album I'd brought from Meeting Street. Between the pages were copies of Henry's wills and old property notes, things we'd filed away over decades. I searched for Hale's handwriting, comparing it to the note. It matched perfectly. For the first time in months, a thin thread of trust wove its way through my doubt. If Hale was reaching out, it wasn't for gossip or leverage. It was because something still existed worth saving. By morning, I had made up my mind. I found my navy coat, the one Henry used to say, made me look like someone who never backs down, and folded the letter into its pocket. I caught my reflection before leaving, not the woman who'd lost her house, but the one who still knew how to stand upright in the aftermath. The cab ride downtown felt longer than it should have. Charleston moved past my window in a blur of soft brick buildings and pale sunlight. When we stopped in front of an old office on Broad Street, the sign above the door was nearly faded, but the name was still legible. Edward Hale, attorney at law. I paid the driver, smoothed the letter once more in my hand, and climbed the steps. Whatever waited beyond that door, I knew it would change the quiet rhythm of my exile, and for the first time since losing everything I wanted it to. Edward Hale's office sat above a narrow row of law firms on Broad Street, the kind of building that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and polished oak. When I stepped inside, the floorboards creaked, as if the walls themselves had grown old, listening to secrets. He rose slowly from behind a desk lined with yellowing folders. His hair was thinner than I remembered, and a pair of heavy glasses slid halfway down his nose. But his eyes, clear gray and steady, still carried the same quiet intelligence Henry had trusted years ago. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, extending a hand. "It's been too long." I sat opposite him, the letter still folded in my pocket. "You asked me to come," I said. "You said they might erase everything." "What did you mean?" He opened a drawer and took out a large envelope sealed with a strip of wax, so old it had begun to crack. He laid it on the desk between us. his hand resting on top as if to keep it from vanishing. "This," he said, "is your husband's original will, the one he signed 3 weeks before the stroke." The room felt suddenly smaller. "I thought the court already had it," I said. "Daniel told me he filed it himself." Hale's mouth tightened. "He did file something, but not this." He slid the envelope toward me. My name, written in Henry's neat script, curved across the top for Marjorie to be opened if needed. My throat went dry. "You're telling me the document in probate isn't real?" He nodded once. A copy was substituted after filing. The version in court names Daniel as executor and transfers full ownership of the Meeting Street property to him. But this, he tapped the envelope, leaves everything to you. Every account, every deed, even the coastal lot your husband purchased in 2008. I still had my copy sealed in storage. I stared at the wax seal, afraid to breathe. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" I asked. He removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "Because I didn't know." The paralegal who handled the probate submission left the firm shortly after Henry's death. I assumed Daniel filed the documents as instructed. But last month, when I was contacted about a verification request, a standard audit from the registrar's office, I checked the digital record. What I saw wasn't what I'd drafted. He paused, the weight of it sinking between us. The metadata showed a new upload same day as the funeral. He continued quietly. Different file name, same signature page. A tremor ran through my hands. "You're saying someone copied Henry's signature?" He met my eyes. "I'm saying someone paid to replace an original document with a doctored one. And I have reason to believe that person was your son." I couldn't speak. Hale leaned back, his expression, neither accusing nor sympathetic, simply resolute. The clerk who handled it mentioned a young man showing up late that evening with a new folder. He claimed the old version had minor errors and needed to be swapped before final processing. A week later, that same clerk received a cash bonus from an anonymous donor. "I've seen this before, Mrs. Ellison. It's not carelessness, it's bribery." The word hung in the air, heavier than grief. I pressed my fingers against the cool edge of the desk. For months, I'd carried the shame of believing I'd failed my own family. Now the truth spread before me like spilled ink, ugly, but undeniable. "What happens now?" I finally asked. Hale replaced his glasses, his voice quiet but firm. "Now we build a case. You'll need copies, notarizations, and patience. The system moves slowly, but truth still has a place here." He pushed a small folder toward me. Inside were scanned pages, each bearing Henry's signature, the original dates still intact. I brushed my thumb over the familiar handwriting, the slight tilt of the letters, the steady pressure of the pen. Henry's voice echoed faintly in my memory. "Marjorie never sign anything you haven't read twice." I'd read everything now, every lie, every line. When I left the office, the late morning sun hit the pavement hard, reflecting off the courthouse steps across the street. I paused for a moment, holding the sealed envelope close to my chest. The city moved around me indifferent, but I could feel something stirring beneath the calm, the first faint pulse of justice still alive, waiting to be woken. The next morning, I met Hale at the Charleston Deed Office, a square brick building tucked behind the courthouse. The air inside was cool and sterile, filled with the faint hum of printers and the shuffling of manila folders. A young clerk led us to a small conference room with a long oak table and a single computer terminal. Hale set his briefcase down and gave me a small, reassuring nod. "We'll start with the property archive," he said. "Everything leaves a trace, even lies." The clerk logged into the county database, her fingers tapping quickly across the keys. Rows of files appeared on the screen, each one representing a piece of land, a transaction, a promise. Hale leaned over her shoulder and typed in Ellison, Henry, and Marjorie. The results, loaded in seconds, mortgage records titles, the final deed transfer to Daniel Ellison, dated the week of Henry's funeral. "Here," Hale said, gesturing toward the screen. "Notice anything strange?" I squinted. The digital file name was slightly different, an underscore where there shouldn't have been one, a timestamp several hours after the clerk's official closing time. He clicked the file open. My husband's signature appeared in blue ink, familiar and precise. The curve of the H, the confident slash through the E, unmistakable. Except Hale said, "This isn't from the will. It's from a mortgage document your husband signed in 2014. Look at this." He pulled a printed copy from his folder and laid it beside the screen. The signatures were identical down to the smallest loop. He placed a transparent sheet over both, aligning them perfectly. The lines matched like a stencil. They lifted his signature digitally, he explained. Scanned, cleaned, and pasted onto a new document. It's not an imitation, it's a copy. My throat tightened. And the court accepted that. They had no reason not to, Hale said quietly. It came from your son, and he used a valid notary seal. That's what made it stick. I stared at the screen at the cold perfection of the forged name. For a moment, it didn't feel like Henry's anymore. It was something hollow. His hand without his voice, his presence without his truth. The clerk left the room to retrieve the hard copy from storage. When the door closed, the hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Hale sat across from me, folding his hands. "Marjorie," he said gently. "This isn't the first time I've seen a family do this. People convince themselves they're fixing something broken. By the time they realize what they've destroyed, it's too late." I looked down at my own name on the old files printed in black ink beside his. Marjorie L. Ellison. Simple, certain. Seeing it there felt like touching a version of myself that hadn't yet been rewritten. The clerk returned carrying a cardboard box filled with old folders. Hale thanked her and began flipping through them. "These are the originals," he said. "Filed before digital conversion. Look, this one still has Henry's thumbprint smudge from the day he signed it." He handed me the page. The faint mark near the bottom made my chest ache. It was proof that his hand had once pressed here, that he had existed in this exact moment alive, deliberate, believing his word would stand after he was gone. I ran my fingers over the smudge, feeling the grain of the paper. "He trusted Daniel," I said softly. "He trusted both of us." Hale's expression didn't change, but his eyes carried something like sorrow. Trust is the first thing people weaponize when they want to make theft look like care. We made copies of everything: the signature overlays, the metadata logs, the 2014 mortgage sheet. Hale organized them into a new folder marked Original Proofs, Private Copy. When we stepped outside, the midday heat hit hard, the air thick with the scent of exhaust and salt water. Across the street, the courthouse windows glinted in the sun. For a brief second, I saw my reflection in the glass, small, solitary, but upright. Inside my bag, the papers rustled softly alive with their own weight. They weren't just evidence. They were ashes, the remains of the truth Henry had left behind, and the beginning of what I was determined to rebuild. The invitation came by text, not phone. Daniel's message was brief, almost formal. "Dinner tomorrow night. Let's make peace. Claire's cooking your favorite salmon with lemon glaze." I stared at the screen for a long time. The words felt rehearsed, like something composed after several drafts. I typed and deleted my reply twice before settling on a single word, "fine." The next evening, I stood at the gate of the Meeting Street house, the one that no longer carried my name. The ironwork gleamed in the porch light, polished as though it had never endured salt air or storms. Inside, laughter drifted faintly through the open windows, Claire's voice smooth and pleasant, setting a rhythm for the night. When I stepped through the door, the scent of rosemary and lemon greeted me. Nothing about the room had changed. The chandelier still glowed above the mahogany table, and Henry's portrait still hung over the mantel. Yet everything felt borrowed, like a set piece in someone else's play. Mom, Daniel said, meeting me halfway across the room. He kissed my cheek, as if habit had guided him more than affection. "You look well." "I'm managing," I said. Claire appeared from the kitchen carrying a platter, her hair pinned neatly, a thin gold chain resting at her throat. "Marjorie," she said brightly, "we're so glad you came." The table shimmered under candlelight china wine glasses, silver cutlery aligned with military precision. For a moment, it was almost comforting, the illusion of normalcy. Then Claire reached for a folder beside her plate and placed it carefully in front of me. "I thought we could settle everything tonight," she said. "For everyone's peace of mind." Daniel cleared his throat. "It's just a release form, Mom. A confirmation that you're satisfied with the estate division. You'll never have to deal with the paperwork again." The folder's corner brushed my wrist. I looked down. Inside the top page was already marked with sticky tabs where my initials should go. "Why now?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "It's time to move forward. The house, everything it's done. We want to make things right." Claire poured the wine, her movements graceful, deliberate. "Let's not make it dramatic," she said softly. "This is about closure." I smiled faintly. "Closure," I repeated. The recorder in my purse blinked red, its light hidden beneath a handkerchief. I hadn't planned to use it tonight. But the moment the word release left her mouth, something old and cold inside me steadied. I reached for the glass of wine, swirling it once before setting it down untouched. "You're both very thorough," I said. Daniel's eyes flickered toward the folder. "It's just a formality. You trust me, don't you?" The question hung there, a blade disguised as kindness. "I used to," I said. Claire's smile faltered, just for a breath, before she recovered. "Then this will be easy." I opened the folder and scanned the lines. Legal phrasing, property codes, clauses meant to sound harmless. At the bottom, my name waited in empty space, printed neatly, ready to be claimed again, this time by someone else's hand. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I'll need time to read," I said. Every word. Claire's nails clicked softly against the wood. "Of course," she said. "We just want you to be comfortable." Dinner continued in brittle politeness. We spoke of weather, of Charleston's spring festivals, of nothing at all. When I finally stood to leave, Daniel offered to walk me out, but I shook my head. The night air was cool against my face as I stepped onto the porch. Behind me, laughter resumed, quieter this time, cautious. In my purse, the recorder hummed softly, holding every word that mattered. I walked away without looking back, the sound of my own heels steady against the stones, measured deliberate, like a heartbeat, refusing to break. The second glass of wine had softened the edges of the evening. Conversations circled through harmless memories, family trips, old neighbors, stories told too many times. Daniel was looser now, the tension in his voice gone. Claire kept his glass full, laughing at all the right moments, though her gaze flicked toward me more often than she wanted it to. The folder lay closed beside my plate. Inside my purse, the recorder hummed quietly, hidden beneath a handkerchief. I hadn't planned on using it, but something told me to keep it running. Daniel leaned back, the faintest smile on his lips. "You know," he said, swirling his wine, "Dad would have hated all this fighting." "I never started a fight," I said softly. He chuckled, tipsy enough to be careless. "No, You just made it hard to end one. Claire's hand brushed his sleeve, a quiet warning. Let's not talk about that tonight, she murmured. We're moving forward. But Daniel didn't stop. His voice grew louder, the words spilling faster, unguarded. It doesn't matter anymore. No one's finding the originals anyway. The air shifted. Claire froze, her hand tightening around her glass. Daniel, she said sharply. Stop. He frowned, confused by her tone. What? It's true. Everything's done. Locked away. The old papers, the recordings, whatever gone. I kept my eyes on the table, hiding the tremor in my hands. The recorder's faint buzz seemed louder now, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Claire's voice trembled as she reached for the folder. You've had enough wine, she said. We don't need to discuss documents. Daniel laughed, careless and unseeing. Relax, Claire. She can't do anything with them. That sentence hung in the air, ugly, final. I folded my napkin and rose. Thank you for dinner, I said quietly. It was good to see the house again. Claire's lips parted to protest, but I was already standing. My hands were steady as I reached for my purse. You always leave when things get real, Daniel muttered. I met his eyes. Maybe I just know when to stop listening. His expression faltered. I didn't mean I know I said, and turned away. The hallway light glowed gold across the polished floor. I passed Henry's portrait on the wall, his painted eyes steady, almost alive. I heard him. Henry, I whispered. Every word. Outside the night was cool and salt-heavy. The cab waited at the curb. I held my purse to my chest, feeling the faint vibration of the recorder, the truth alive and waiting. When the car pulled away, I didn't look back. The chandelier still burned behind the curtains, its light trembling, as though the house itself knew something had just changed forever. 2 mornings after the dinner, I returned to Hale's office, with the recorder tucked carefully inside my coat pocket. He listened to the file in silence, his expression tightening only once, when Daniel's voice spoke the words, No one's finding the originals anyway. When it ended, he removed his glasses and set them on the desk. That's enough to prove intent, he said quietly, but not enough to rebuild the case. We'll need the originals or something that verifies their destruction. He glanced toward the doorway. There's someone I'd like you to meet. A young woman stepped in carrying a box of folders. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her dark hair tied back in a loose braid, her blazer still wrinkled from the morning commute. Her eyes, though clear, steady, belonged to someone who'd already learned how cruel paper could be. This is Grace Whitlow, Hale said. She's been working with me since last year. Grace set the box on the table and offered her hand. It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Ellison. I've read the filings. I think we can find something they missed. Her tone held no hesitation, only quiet conviction. Hale nodded toward the box. Grace's father lost his pension to a falsified trust 20 years ago. She knows how to spot forgery better than anyone I've trained. Grace smiled faintly. I suppose you could say I take it personally. We spent the afternoon in the county records office, surrounded by the smell of dust and old ink. Grace scrolled through reels of microfilm, her gloved fingers steady as she turned the crank. The soft whir of the machine filled the silence. Every deed transfer leaves an echo, she said, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. Even if they erase the file, the metadata stays. Timestamps, clerk, initials, authorization codes. People forget that computers remember everything. I watched her work, struck by the calm precision of her movements. It reminded me of how I used to grade papers late into the night, when I taught each mark deliberate, every line holding consequence. After 2 hours, she stopped suddenly. Here she said, Deed for 4713. A meeting, street property, Original scan logged April 2nd, 2019. Replacement uploaded April 2nd, 2019, 9:47. PM. She leaned closer. That's after office hours. Someone used a private key to access the system. Hale exhaled softly. It's exactly what we needed. I stared at the screen, the faint lines of the old document glowing in silver light. The timestamp felt like proof that the truth still had fingerprints. When we finally stepped outside, the late afternoon sun caught Grace's hair, turning it to copper. She smiled at me, a quiet, knowing smile that carried both determination and understanding. For what it's worth, she said, "You're not alone in this anymore." Her words lingered long after we parted, carried on the warm Charleston wind that smelled faintly of salt and possibility. The search dragged on for weeks. Each morning, Grace and I met at the courthouse or the records office, chasing scraps of information. Old ledgers, archived letters, forgotten memos. Most days ended in silence. Still, we kept looking, guided less by hope than by stubbornness. Haley worked quietly in the background, filing discreet requests and warning us to move carefully. "They're watching," he said. "If Daniel suspects what we're after, he won't hesitate to bury it again." By the third week, we had combed through nearly everything under Henry's name, except one peculiar entry. Grace found it one evening, leaning close to the glowing screen. "Account ending in 72B, she murmured. "No withdrawals, no closure, just a yearly maintenance fee." "A trust?" I asked. She shook her head. "Too small. Looks like a safe deposit box." That clue took us to Charleston National Bank, its marble columns worn smooth by decades. The manager, a cautious man with silver-rimmed glasses, examined Hale's documents and frowned. "Box registered to Henry Ellison," he said. "Secondary note. For retrieval by spouse upon written confirmation of identity. It's been untouched for 4 years." He disappeared into the vault, leaving us with only the faint hum of fluorescent lights. When he returned, he carried a small metal box sealed with old tape. "Sign here," he said. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote my name. Grace helped me lift the lid. Inside lay 3 things: a flash drive wrapped in tissue, a thin stack of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon, and an envelope addressed in Henry's handwriting. "For Marjorie, if she stands before you, believe her." My throat tightened. Grace stepped back, giving me space. I unfolded the letter. "If this reaches you, something has gone wrong. I trusted Daniel to handle my affairs, but trust can be misused. I've left copies of the deeds and digital records for your protection. Don't let anyone tell you what you own. You've already earned it." The signature Love H blurred as tears filled my eyes. Grace's voice was soft. "You found it." The papers beneath bore the state seal Henry's real signature pressed deep into the page. Proof undeniable. Grace called Hale immediately. "Keep them sealed," he said through the phone. "That flash drive might be what saves everything." When we stepped outside, dusk had fallen over Charleston. The harbor wind smelled of rain and magnolia. Grace locked the documents in her satchel, and I held Henry's letter against my chest. For the first time in months, the weight I carried wasn't loss, it was truth. Chapter 12. Shadows at my door. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The door to my apartment stood slightly open, the brass lock bent inward, as if someone had forced it. A draft carried the faint smell of damp paper and cologne, one that wasn't mine. Inside, the lamp by the window had been knocked over its shade, split in 2. Drawers hung open clothes strewn across the floor. The box that had once held the safe deposit papers lay empty, its lid cracked down the center. I stepped carefully through the wreckage, my heartbeat rising in my throat. Every sound, each creak of the floorboards felt amplified. My first thought was of the flash drive. Gone. The copies Grace had made gone too. I reached for the desk where I'd kept Henry's letter, half afraid of what I'd find. The drawer slid open with a rasp. The envelope was still there, untouched. I lifted it out with trembling fingers, the weight of it strangely comforting. His handwriting looked exactly as it had when I'd found it in the vault, steady, deliberate, alive, in a way that defied absence. On the mirror above the dresser, black marker letters glared back at me. Stop digging. The message was jagged, hurried, written by a hand that didn't care about being understood. I stared at it until the reflection blurred. My knees gave out for a second, and I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing through the tightness in my chest. I'd known this might happen. Hale had warned me that once we drew blood from their secrets, they would strike back. Still, the violation felt personal, like they'd reached into the last corner of my life I thought was safe. The phone rang once. Unknown number. It stopped before I could answer. I forced myself to stand, to move. Fear only grows in stillness, Henry used to say. I gathered what was left. The letter, the house keys, my phone, and called Hale. My voice steadied halfway through the sentence. They were here, I said. Everything's gone except his letter. He didn't ask who they were. He simply said, "We'll start again." When I hung up, I looked once more at the mirror. My reflection stood beneath the warning, small but unbroken. I wiped a line through the words with the edge of my sleeve, smearing the ink until it lost its power. The room smelled of dust and fear, but the night outside was quiet. I turned off the lights, locked the door again, and sat by the window with the letter in my hands. The city hummed softly in the distance, unaware of what had been taken, unaware of what still remained. Grace arrived at my apartment just after sunset, her hair damp from the rain that had begun to fall. She didn't speak when she stepped inside. She only glanced around the room, taking in the overturned lamp and the black smudges still faintly visible on the mirror. Without a word, she placed her bag on the table and powered up her laptop. "We'll start with what's left," she said. For the next few hours, the apartment filled with the rhythmic hum of the printer and the soft scratch of pen against paper. Grace had managed to recover fragments of the missing files from a shared drive, metadata, timestamps, scanned receipts. They weren't perfect, but they were enough to prove continuity, to show the chain of ownership that Daniel's forgery had broken. I watched her work her fingers, quick and certain. Every few minutes, she'd glance up, her expression unreadable, then return to typing. I brewed coffee, though neither of us drank much of it. The room smelled faintly of ink and rain-soaked air. At one point, she slid a document across the table. "This is a sworn affidavit," she said. "Your statement in your own words. It doesn't need to be long, just clear. Say when you discovered the forged will, what was taken, and how the originals were found." My hand didn't shake as I signed. Somewhere between fear and exhaustion, a strange steadiness had taken root. When we finished, Grace stacked the papers into 2 neat piles. "One for Hale," she said. "One for you." She slipped hers into a waterproof folder and tucked it under her arm. I looked around the small apartment, the patched wall, the thin curtains, the faint smell of smoke that had never quite left after the break-in. For the first time, it didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like a command post. The phone rang close to midnight. Hale's voice came through low but firm. "The hearing is confirmed for 10 a.m. Judge Mitchell will preside. Bring everything." "I'll be there," I said. He hesitated before adding, "You've done the hard part already. Tomorrow is just the truth, walking into daylight." After the call ended, Grace gathered her coat. "Get some rest," she said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be long." When the door closed behind her, the silence returned, but it no longer pressed down on me. I sat by the window watching the rain slide down the glass. Charleston's streetlights blurred into streaks of gold and silver, each drop carrying its own reflection. I unfolded Henry's letter once more and traced the final line with my finger. His words had never felt closer or more alive. I whispered into the quiet room not as a promise, but as a certainty that had waited too long to be spoken. They'll stop laughing tomorrow. The morning broke bright and merciless over Charleston. The courthouse steps gleamed in the sunlight, the stone pale against the sky. Reporters had already gathered, their cameras flashing in quick bursts as Grace and I climbed the stairs. Hale walked between us, his briefcase clutched tight in one hand, his jaw set. "This isn't about noise," he murmured as we reached the top. "It's about precision. They'll expect emotion, don't give it to them." I nodded. My coat felt heavy despite the warmth its inner pocket carrying the flash drive, the affidavit, and the small recorder that had captured the dinner. The words were still there, untouched, waiting for their moment. Inside the courtroom buzzed with low conversation. Faces turned as we entered, some curious, others pitying. On the far side, Daniel sat beside his attorney, a man I'd never seen before, younger than I expected, his suit too polished, his smile too sure. Claire sat behind them, her expression composed, but her hands twisted the edge of her scarf again and again. The bailiff called for order. Judge Mitchell entered the room, rising to its feet, before settling again into silence. He was a man in his late 60s, tall, silver-haired, and steady-eyed. I'd seen him once before, years ago, when Henry and I finalized the purchase of the Meeting Street home. He'd congratulated us then, saying that house will outlast every storm. Now he looked at me with a trace of recognition that faded into formality. Hale opened the case with calm precision. He presented the sealed will, Henry's letter, and the affidavit. Daniel's attorney rose to object before the clerk even finished logging the exhibits. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this case is nothing more than confusion and misplaced grief. My client's mother, while well-intentioned, is operating under emotional delusion. She's a widow overwhelmed and unfortunately misled by opportunistic parties." A ripple of laughter, quiet but sharp, spread through the benches behind him. My spine stiffened. Hale's gaze flicked to me, a silent warning, "Stay still." The attorney continued, pacing slowly. "We're talking about a 70-year-old woman whose recollection of events is, let's say, selective. The documents she's presented were conveniently discovered after the supposed break-in of her residence, an incident with no verified police report. Your Honor, what we have here is a fragile woman chasing ghosts." He turned toward me, his smile tightening. "Mrs. Ellison, I truly sympathize, but grief can be deceptive, can't it?" The judge's gavel struck once, a low, decisive sound. "Watch your tone, counselor." But the words had already landed. For a heartbeat, the courtroom swam in heat and light. I could feel every eye on me, watching, measuring. I rose slowly, my knees steady beneath me. "With respect, Your Honor. I said I may be 70, but I am not confused. I have something my son and his counsel seem to have misplaced clarity." The judge nodded once. "You may proceed." I reached into my bag and withdrew the small recorder. Grace moved quietly to connect it to the court speaker system, her hands sure and practiced. Daniel shifted in his chair, his smile faltering just slightly. "This," I said, pressing the button, "was recorded during a dinner held at my former home on Meeting Street." The first sound was faint, the clinking of cutlery, the rustle of napkins. Then Daniel's voice, unmistakable, filled the room. "It doesn't even matter anymore. No one's finding the originals anyway." The words echoed through the chamber, clear, unedited, final. A murmur rippled through the spectators' seats. Claire's face drained of color. The attorney's mouth opened, then shut again, his composure cracking like porcelain. Daniel half rose his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "That's taken out of context," he stammered. "She recorded me without consent. This is illegal." Judge Mitchell raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Ellison." His tone left no room for argument. Hale stepped forward. "Your Honor, the audio directly corroborates a sequence of fraudulent acts tied to the substitution of the will. The metadata we submitted confirms a digital alteration timestamp matching the same period referenced in this recording." The judge's gaze shifted toward Daniel. "Mr. Ellison, do you wish to respond?" Daniel's jaw clenched. For the first time, his confidence faltered completely. His eyes darted toward Claire, but she stared down at her lap, her fingers unmoving. "I don't," he began, but the rest of the words dissolved into silence. I looked at him, then not as an enemy, but as the boy I'd once taught to hold a pen to write his own name carefully. And now it was that same name, his voice, his proof that was undoing him. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "The recording will remain on file. The court will adjourn for a brief recess before determining preliminary judgment." The gavel struck again. The sound was thunderous. I exhaled slow and deep as the murmur swelled into the hallway outside. Cameras flashed through the open door, voices rising. Hale placed a steady hand on my arm as we gathered the papers. Grace smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with restrained triumph. In the chaos of movement, Daniel's voice reached me, soft, strained, and barely above a whisper. "Mom, you didn't have to do this." I turned toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time in years. "You did," I said quietly. And then I walked past him through the crowd of strangers and cameras into the bright Charleston morning, where the truth finally had a sound. When the recess ended, the courtroom returned to its tense, electric quiet. The air felt thicker now, expectant, watchful. Reporters had packed the gallery, their pens hovering, ready to capture whatever would come next. I sat beside Hale and Grace, my hands folded in my lap, the faint smell of varnished wood mingling with the sharp scent of paper. Daniel no longer looked at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, his shoulders rigid. Claire sat behind him, pale and small, her perfect composure stripped away. The echo of his recorded confession still hung in the room, like a shadow no one could ignore. Judge Mitchell adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale," he said, "you indicated there was one final piece of evidence." Hale rose, his expression steady, his voice calm. "Yes, Your Honor. The original letter written by Mr. Henry Ellison found in the same sealed deposit box as the authentic will. It was addressed directly to this court." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the letter, Henry's handwriting, unmistakable even from a distance. The blue ink had faded slightly, but the script was firm, deliberate. Hale passed it to the bailiff, who brought it forward. The judge studied it in silence, then unfolded the single sheet with care. The paper rustled softly, the sound sharp in the hush that filled the room. He began to read aloud, his voice low but resonant. "To whom this may concern, if my wife stands before you, she does so not out of ambition or greed, but because the truth has been buried beneath the names of those who feared it. If she stands before you, she has already carried more than any man could bear. I leave not only my estate to her, but my faith that integrity once proven will restore what love built. Believe her as I always did." The judge paused. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. I stared at the floor, unable to lift my gaze. Every word was Henry's, his cadence, his heart. I could almost hear him saying it across the breakfast table, his hand covering mine, his quiet certainty anchoring me once more. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Someone in the back sniffled. Another whispered something too soft to catch. Even Claire's hands trembled visibly in her lap. The judge folded the letter again, his expression unreadable. He looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Ellison," he said quietly, "this letter bears your father's signature notarized and verified. Do you contest its authenticity?" Daniel's throat worked before he managed to speak. "No," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's real." The judge nodded almost gently. "Then there is nothing left to debate." The words felt like a release. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath until it left me all at once. Hale rested a hand on my shoulder, a quiet reassurance that everything we'd fought for had reached its end. When the gavel struck, the sound didn't feel like victory. It felt like absolution's soft final and unbearably human. I glanced once at the letter resting on the judge's desk. The blue ink caught a glint of light from the high window above, and for a fleeting second, it looked almost alive, as if Henry himself were still here, watching the truth rise back into daylight. When Judge Mitchell returned to the bench, the courtroom fell into absolute stillness. The afternoon light had shifted, cutting through the high windows in thin golden bars. Dust motes drifted in the air, turning the moment almost unreal. He adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the stack of papers before him, the letters, the affidavits, the sealed will now open for all to see. Then he spoke, his voice calm, deliberate, heavy with finality. "This court recognizes the original will of the late Henry Ellison as valid. The subsequent documents entered into probate under the authority of Daniel Ellison are hereby declared forgeries. All property assets and holdings listed under the Ellison estate will be reinstated to Mrs. Marjorie Ellison immediately." A sound rippled through the room. Half gasp, half release. I didn't move. For so long I had imagined this moment, but when it came, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like gravity. Daniel's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Daniel didn't seem to hear. His face had gone pale, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. After a long silence, he spoke. Not to the judge, not to his lawyer, but to the air between us. "I only wanted to save it," he said quietly. "The business, the family name, everything Dad built." The words came out cracked, fragile. Hale rose slowly, his tone even. "Mr. Ellison, saving something by destroying its foundation is not preservation. It's loss by another name." Daniel's eyes met mine at last. For a heartbeat, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who built boats from driftwood and lined them along the pond, proud and certain that nothing good ever sank. Now that certainty was gone. "I thought you'd understand," he whispered. "I do," I said softly. "That's what makes it hurt." Behind him, Claire stood abruptly. The scrape of her chair cut through the silence like a blade. She gathered her purse, eyes bright with unshed tears, and turned without a word. The echo of her heels followed her all the way down the aisle and out into the hall. The judge gavelled once more. "This matter is settled. Court is adjourned." I rose slowly, every movement deliberate, as though my body still feared that one wrong step might undo everything. Hale exhaled beside me, the faintest smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. Grace's eyes glistened with quiet relief, but Daniel didn't look up again. His shoulders sagged forward, the weight of his choices finally pressing him down. As the bailiff approached, he covered his face with one hand, the other gripping the table. I wanted to reach for him, to offer something, anything, But there was nothing left that wouldn't cheapen the truth we had fought to restore. The light streaming through the windows shifted again, falling across the bench, across the letter that had saved me, and finally across him. For the first time in years, everything that had been hidden was illuminated pain, love, and the unspoken cost of justice. Autumn came quietly that year. The air over Charleston carried the scent of wet leaves and salt, and the harbor winds had turned soft and cool. From the front porch of my new house, a small place on the edge of town, with white shutters and a narrow garden, I watched the rain drift through the light from the street lamp. The sound of it against the roof was steady, familiar, almost like breathing. It had been 3 months since the verdict. Life had settled into something slower, not peaceful, yet but learning to be. The letters were filed, the house on Meeting Street, legally mine again, though I hadn't stepped foot inside since that day in court. Hale had handled the final papers, and Grace had taken a position in the city's legal aid office, helping families, who reminded her, she said, of where we started. Sometimes she stopped by with files or just coffee, her laughter echoing through the kitchen like a song I hadn't realized I missed. Daniel hadn't called. I'd heard from Hale that he was cooperating with the investigation, turning over emails, bank records, whatever was left to make peace with the truth. I didn't ask for more. There were questions I no longer needed answered. That evening, I stood by the window as the sky dimmed into violet. The garden below glistened small pools of rainwater, catching the light from the porch lamp. I'd planted rosemary and lavender there, the kind Henry used to brush between his fingers when he passed, saying, "It smells like patience." The thought of him didn't ache anymore. It rested the way rain rests in the soil, before becoming part of something living again. I reached for the light switch beside the door and turned on the porch lamp. Its glow spread across the steps, soft and gold, touching the wet petals, the quiet path, the world beyond the fence. For years I'd left that light on, hoping someone would come home. Tonight it wasn't for waiting. It was for keeping. I stepped outside, the air cool against my face, and leaned on the railing. Charleston stretched beyond the trees, its rooftops glistening, its windows flickering like distant stars. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and still. They laughed when I walked in, I whispered into the rain. But when I walked out, the room was silent. The wind carried the words away, and in their place, only the hum of the porch light remained steady, unwavering, warm against the quiet dark.